Welcome to Essential Libertarianism, selected readings from Voluntaryist.com. Essential Libertarianism is voluntarism. Let's reclaim the anti-political heritage of this philosophy together. The essays and books we read in this show will bring us closer to the state-free voluntary society that we desire. Let's begin the journey.
Voluntarist Critiques of State Education by George H. Smith. Editor's note: the author of this article is probably best known to readers of this newsletter as the person responsible for suggesting its title, The Voluntaryist. The following excerpts first appeared as the introduction to an anthology edited by George H. Smith and Marilyn Moore, titled Critiques of State Education, Washington, D.C., Cato Institute, 2017. The relationship between school and state and American liberal thought has a checkered past. Many traditional heroes of American individualism, such as Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, upheld some role for government and education, however minor that role is by today's standard. Even William Leggett, the radical Jacksonian and laissez-faire advocate who opposed nearly all kinds of government intervention, made an exception in the case of education. Radical individualism in America was a different matter. Josiah Warren, often regarded as the first American anarchist, warned in 1833 that national aid to education would be like paying the fox to take care of the chickens, and said he feared the consequences of placing control of education in the hands of a single group. Gerrit Smith, a radical abolitionist who supported John Brown, upheld the separation of church and state. It is justice and not charity which the people need at the hands of government, Smith argued. Let government restore to them their land and what other rights they have been robbed of, and they will be able to pay for themselves, to pay their schoolmasters as well as their parsons. William Yeomans, an admirer of Herbert Spencer and a founder and editor of Popular Science Monthly, favored leaving education to private enterprise. And the Spencerian John Bonham vigorously attacked the one true system of Horace Mann that would impose a dulling uniformity and would extirpate diversity in education. The most thorough arguments against state education appeared in the writings of British classical liberals during the 1840s and 1850s. Calling themselves voluntarists, a label originally embraced by those who called for the complete disestablishment of the Church of England, these liberals launched a sustained campaign against state education in England that, though it was doomed to failure, produced a remarkable body of literature that has been largely ignored by historians. The British voluntarist movement grew from the ranks of dissenters or nonconformists, i.e., non-Anglican Protestants. After the restoration of Charles II in 1660, dissenters who refused to subscribe to the Articles of the Established Church of England faced severe legal disabilities. Oxford and Cambridge were effectively closed to them, as were other conventional channels of education. Dissenters therefore established their own educational institutions, such as the dissenting academies of the 18th century, which one historian has described as the greatest schools of their day. Until 1833, elementary education in England progressed without substantial state aid or interference. Free education on an ambitious scale has been undertaken by dissenters or nonconformists with the establishment in 1808 of the British and Foreign School Society, originally called the Royal Lancasterian Society. Founded primarily by dissenting congregations, the society used the monitorial system, which employed abler students to help teach their classmates, to bring education to the working classes without government assistance. These efforts motivated Anglicans to form the National Society, which established competing free schools for educating the poor. Over the next decade, government funds were made available to both dissenters and Anglicans. Each pound from voluntary contributions was matched by the government, up to £20,000 per annum. Because the Anglican schools were receiving more contributions than the dissenting schools, the former received most of the government funds, so dissenters began to learn the hard way that government aid to education would serve the prevailing orthodoxy. Even by 1839, when the Melbourne administration proposed to increase aid to £30,000 per annum, relatively few dissenters expressed opposition. Most dissenters approved of, or silently accepted, state funding if it did not favor one religious group over another, and if it did not entail state interference. The one dissenting deputy, who argued that education is not a legitimate function of the government, could find no support among his peers. And a meeting of dissenting ministers in 1840 expressed its satisfaction with government aid for education. All this changed in 1843 after Sir James Graham, Home Secretary under the Peel administration, presented a bill to the House of Commons titled A Bill for Regulating the Employment of Children and Young Persons in Factories and for the Better Education of Children in Factory Districts. Among other things, the bill required factory children to attend school for at least 3 hours each day, 5 days per week, and it placed effective control of those schools, to be financed largely from local rates, in the hands of the established Church of England. "The Church has ample security," wrote Graham, "that every master in the new schools will be a churchman, and that the teaching of the Holy Scriptures, as far as the limited exposition may be carried, will necessarily be in conformity with his creed." Dissenting opposition to Graham's bill was swift and severe. It set the whole country on fire, according to one observer. Eclectic Review, a leading dissenting journal, declared, "From one end of the empire to the other, the sound of alarm has gone forth, and the hundreds of thousands who have answered to its call have astonished and confounded our opponents. The movement has been at once simultaneous and determined. The old spirit of the Puritans has returned to their children, and men in high places are in consequence standing aghast, astonished at what they witness, reluctant to forego their nefarious purpose, yet scarce daring to persist in the scheme." Thousands of petitions with over 2 million signatures were presented to the House in opposition to the Factories Education Bill, whereupon Graham submitted amendments in an effort to appease the dissenters, but to no avail. Petitions against the amended clauses contained nearly another 2 million signatures, and the measure was withdrawn. It was during this agitation that support by dissenters for state aid to education, provided it did not involve interference, transformed into opposition to all such aid. Edward Baines, Jr., editor of the Leeds Mercury, the most influential provincial newspaper in England, described the transition, "the dangerous bill of Sir James Graham, and the evidence brought out of the ability and disposition of the people to supply the means of education, combined to convince the editors of the Mercury that it is far safer and better for government not to interfere at all in the work." And from that time forward, they distinctly advocated that view. The voluntarist philosophy crystallized quickly. In meetings of the Congregational Union held in Leeds in October of 1843, Baines articulated the basic arguments against state education that he would develop in more detail over the next 20 years. The Congregational Union officially declared itself in favor of voluntary education. An education conference held at the Congregational Union in Leeds in December of 1843 resolved that all funds confided to the disposal of the Central Committee in aid of schools be granted only to schools sustained entirely by voluntary contributions. By 1846, the majority of Congregationalists and Baptists supported voluntary education. Leading newspapers and journals of the dissenters, such as the Leeds Mercury, the Nonconformist, and the Eclectic Review, argued the case for voluntarism. Many voluntarists were active in the Anti-Corn Law League, which led a successful campaign to abolish import tariffs on grain, and they applied the principles of free trade to education. Voluntarists energetically disputed reports that purported to show the deplorable condition of voluntary schools, and they accused government committees of misrepresenting facts and distorting evidence to buttress their case for government interference. Not all dissenters supported voluntarism. Of course, some nonconformist journals, such as the British Quarterly Review, attacked voluntarism vigorously. In addition, some Manchester free trade advocates, most notably Richard Codman, were active in the movement for state secular education, creating a serious rift among British liberals. Indeed, in 1848, Cobden remarked that education is the main cause of the split among the middle-class liberals. In Leeds, the question was whether the state should intervene at all, while in Manchester it concerned the form that intervention should take. Leeds imposed a prescriptive ban upon state education per se, Manchester sought to define the proper goals of a state education scheme that was both necessary and desirable. One important voluntarist was Herbert Spencer, the leading libertarian philosopher of his day. Although Spencer became an agnostic, he was homeschooled in dissenting causes by his father and uncle. "Our family was essentially a dissenting family," Spencer wrote in later life, "and dissent is an expression of antagonism to arbitrary control." Much of Spencer's first political article, written in his early 20s and published in the Nonconformist in 1842, was devoted to a critique of state education, and it possibly influenced the birth of the voluntarist movement in the following year. Other prominent dissenters who campaigned for voluntarism were Joseph Sturge, a Quaker pacifist who played an important role in the anti-slavery movement, Samuel Morley, Andrew Reed, Henry Richard, Edward Meale, and the previously mentioned Edward Baines Jr. Of these men, Meale and Baines were the most important. Edward Meale founded and edited the Nonconformist, one of the most important dissenting periodicals of its day. Meale was a tireless campaigner for both the separation of church and state and the separation of school and state. Edward Baines Jr., for many years editor of the influential Leeds Mercury, was the driving force behind voluntarism after 1843. Through Baines's many pamphlets and articles, which combined theoretical arguments with detailed statistics, the case for voluntarism reached a wide audience throughout Britain. Voluntarism is perhaps the most important libertarian philosophy, and this podcast is designed to give you a piece of that. But there is a ton of other information out there on the topic of voluntarism. This is why we've compiled an easy list of great voluntarist resources in one location as a one-stop shop for the very best voluntarist content out there. From authors such as Lysander Spooner, Henry David Thoreau, Etienne de la Boétie, Larkin Rose, Carl Watner, Herbert Spencer, and more at essentiallibertarianism.com/books. The best part is that every time you buy something from that list, you help support this show without having to pay a penny extra. So go to essentiallibertarianism.com/books today to start or accelerate your journey to the only non-political, non-violent strategy to achieve a free society and help us delegitimize the state. essentiallibertarianism.com/books. Liberty was a basic concern of all voluntarists. Dissenters saw themselves in the tradition of John Milton, Algernon Sidney, and John Locke, defenders of individual rights and foes of oppressive government. Religious liberty in particular, freedom of conscience, was viewed as the great heritage of the dissenting tradition, any violation of which should call forth stern and indomitable resistance. Liberty should not be sacrificed for a greater good, argued the dissenting minister and voluntarist Richard Hamilton. There is no greater good. There can be no greater good. It is not simply means, it is an end. Education is best promoted by freedom, but should there ever be a conflict, liberty is more precious than education. We love education, Hamilton stated, but there are things which we love better. Edward Baines argued that education is not the ultimate good. Liberty is far more precious. It is essential to all the virtues which dignify men and communities. The preservation of individual freedom, according to most voluntarists, is the only legitimate function of government. The purpose of government, wrote Herbert Spencer in The Proper Sphere of Government, 1842, is to defend the natural rights of man, to protect person and property, to prevent the aggressions of the powerful upon the weak, in a word, to administer justice. Edward Meale agreed that government is an organ for the protection of life, liberty, and property, or in other words, for the administration of justice. Government, an ever-present danger to liberty, must be watched with vigilance and suspicion. The true lover of liberty, stated the Eclectic Review, will jealously examine all the plans and measures of government. He will seldom find himself called to help it, and to weigh down its scale. He will watch its increase of power with distrust. He will specially guard against conceding to it anything which might be otherwise done. He would deprecate its undertaking of bridges, highways, railroads. He would foresee the immense mischief of its direction of hospitals and asylums. Government has enough on its hands, its own proper functions, nor need it to be overborne. There is a class of governments which are called paternal. They exact a soulless obedience. Nothing breathes and stirs. The song of liberty is forgotten. And when such governments tamper with education, the tyranny, instead of being relieved, is eternized. Government is essentially immoral, wrote Spencer in Social Statics, and with this many voluntarists agreed. A government has only those rights delegated to it by individuals, and it is for each to say whether he will employ such an agent or not. Every person, therefore, has the right to ignore the state. The source of political authority is the people, argued Hamilton, and the people may revise or even outlaw the state. Voluntarists' concerns for liberty can scarcely be exaggerated. Schemes of state education were denounced repeatedly as the knell of English freedom, an assault on our constitutional liberties, and so forth. Plans for government inspection of schools were likened to government surveillance and universal espionage that display the police spirit. And compulsory education was described as child kidnapping. Educational freedom is a sacred thing because it is an essential branch of civil freedom. A system of state education, declared Baines, is a vast intellectual police set to watch over the young at the most critical period of their existence, to prevent the intrusion of dangerous thoughts and turn their minds into safe channels. Contrary to later historians who were to portray voluntarism as a battle for narrow sectarian interests, the voluntarists insisted that crucial moral and political principles were at stake. The crisis involves larger interests than those of dissent, stated the Eclectic Review. The threat that state education poses to individual freedom is sufficiently ground to take up a position of most determined hostility to it. The voluntarist often drew parallels between educational freedom on the one hand and religious freedom, freedom of the press, and other civil liberties on the other hand. As Baines noted, we cannot violate the principles of liberty in regard to education without furnishing at once a precedent and an inducement to violate them in regard to other matters. He concluded, "In my judgment, the state could not consistently assume the support and control of education without assuming the support and control of both the pulpit and the press. Once decided that government money and government superintendents are essential in the schools, whether to ensure efficiency or to guard against abuse, ignorance, and error, and the selfsame reasons will force you to apply government money and government superintendents to our periodical literature and our religious instruction." Baines realized that a government need not carry the principle inherent in state education to its logical extreme, but he was disturbed by a precedent that gave to government the power of molding minds. If, as the proponents of state education had argued, state education was required to promote civic virtue and moral character, then where, acting on these principles, could you consistently stop? He asked, would not the same paternal care which is exerted to provide schools, schoolmasters, and school books be justly extended to provide mental food for the adult and to guard against his food being poisoned? In short, would not the principle clearly justify the appointment of the ministers of religion and a censorship of the press? Baines conceded that there were deficiencies and imperfections in the system of voluntary education, but freedom should not be abrogated on this account. Again, he pointed to the example of a free press. A free press has many defects and abuses. Certainly not all the products of a free press are praiseworthy. But if liberty is to be sacrificed in education in order to remedy deficiencies, then why not regulate and censor the press for the same reason? Baines employed this analogy in his brilliant rejoinder to the charge that he was an advocate of bad schools. In one sense I am. I maintain that we have as much right to have wretched schools as to have wretched newspapers, wretched preachers, wretched books, wretched institutions, wretched political economists, wretched members of parliament, and wretched ministers. You cannot prescribe all these things without prescribing liberty. The man is a simpleton who says that to advocate liberty is to advocate badness. The man is a quack and a doctrinaire of the worst German breed who would attempt to force all minds, whether individual or national, into a mold of ideal perfection. To stretch it out or to lop it down to his own Procrustean standard maintaining that liberty is the chief cause of excellence, but it would cease to be liberty if you prescribed everything inferior. Cultivate giants if you please, but do not stifle dwarfs. Freedom of conscience was precious to liberal dissenters, and they feared government encroachment in this realm, even in the guise of secular education. The Eclectic Review, using arguments similar to those of Baines, stressed the relationship between religious freedom and educational freedom. Advocates of state education claim that parents have the duty to provide their children with an education, and that the state has the right to enforce this duty. But parents have a duty to provide religious and moral instruction as well. Are we then prepared to maintain that government should interpose, in this case, to supply what the parent has failed to communicate? If sound in the one case, it is equally so in the other. To the many state school advocates who pointed to the Prussian system as a model, Baines retorted, "Nearly all the continental governments which pay and direct the school pay and direct also the pulpit and the press. They do it consistently." This is the potential despotism that Baines feared and loathed.
Thank you for listening to Essential Libertarianism. You can check out the archives of all of our episodes at essentiallibertarianism.com. And you can subscribe to future episodes on any podcatcher, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and more. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.